as we come again to the book of Luke, the gospel account written by Luke chapter 7. But we'll pause for a brief word of prayer as we open God's word. Lord in heaven, thank you so much for being with us, not only in the wonderful times, but in the difficult times. Please guide as we reflect on Jesus' actions and his words, and as we seek ways to apply them in our own personal lives. In his name we pray. Amen. Because of being on the road a fair bit with work, I like to listen to books. Even when I was teaching at Weimar College, which is where we came from a year ago, I like to, where possible, get into books that tell of the people's experiences, their lives. But now, with a lot of road time, I would tell my students, and I do the same thing, you can read two different ways. You can read with your eyes or with your ears. And in the car, please don't read with your eyes. I was stupid enough to do that when I was a young pastor in Michigan. And there was a book I just couldn't put down, and then the Lord convicted me, look, you're putting your life and other people's lives at risk, kind of holding the steering wheel like this, reading. Maybe some of you have read that book by Roger Morneau, Trip into the Supernatural. It's like you can't put it down. Anyway, since then I've switched to the ears, which are safer when hands and eyes should be dealing with road conditions. And the one I'm just listening to at this moment is by the COO and COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, and she tells the experience of 11 years after their wedding. She and her husband and another couple were in Mexico celebrating the other guy's 50th birthday, and as they were together playing games on their iPads, she said, I'm getting awfully sleepy. I think I'll go to sleep now, not realizing those were her last words to her husband, because when she woke up, she couldn't find him. And they looked and looked, and then she found his body on the gym floor where he had been working out on an elliptical and had some kind of apparently massive coronary event that caused him to fall off and die. And her whole life was so different, shattered. She didn't have the financial strain that other people have, but she and a person that became her friend named Adam, that was also a psychologist, helped to walk through in this book called Option B. They walk through the journey of what you experience when everything falls apart, and you can't go with option A. As she had said to this friend at one point, I just wish Dave, her deceased husband, I just wish Dave could be here for this next event in the children's lives. And the friend said, well, that was option A, which is no longer available. You need to live with option B. It was tough love, but she realized it was true. And she tells about option B. Well, if you come with me where we last left off, I guess I'm kind of part of option B here. Option A was here 2 weeks ago, 2 Sabbaths ago. And I'm thankful the Lord blessed you with Pastor Brad and his family, Brad Ginger. And he's doing, I'm sure, a good job in his new district for his second Sabbath. But let's look at Jesus dealing with an option B. Luke 7:11. Now it happened the day after. The day after what? He had been up in Capernaum. It says, as you had in I think the last sermon that Pastor Brad had here was Luke 7, the first 10 verses, where Jesus was in Capernaum coming to meet the centurion who had a sick servant. And that man had such faith, but the day after he went into a city called Nain, or in that language, Nine. Sounds like the number 9 in English, or like the German for no. But as you go to Nain, or Nain, you'd be coming way down on the south end of Galilee. Capernaum's up on the north shore, so Jesus had to travel about 25 miles. So he probably started his journey the same day he talked to the centurion, and he's working his way down. This is part of his second missionary tour. This is 2 years into Jesus' ministry. He's been baptized AD 27 in fulfillment of prophecy, and he ministered with people, sometimes with him, sometimes not. Peter, James, John, others. Eventually, he has all the disciples together. It's his first missionary tour with them. So you can think We don't have all the gospel story with 12 people with Jesus, but at this point, there are 12 people with Jesus. And he's in their first group journey. Many of his disciples went with him. When it says it that way, it's not just the ones you named, those 12, Peter, James, John, Matthew, etc. No, many of his disciples, we find 120 of them gathered in the upper room after Jesus ascended to heaven. We don't know how many were in this group of disciples. It said a large crowd, though, and there are many. So you can just imagine the energy, the enthusiasm. I mean, he just got done healing a man without seeing him. The man just said, "You speak, and he'll be well." And Jesus said, "I've never seen such faith in all of Israel." And he traveled down along the western coast of Galilee, a beautiful area. Now there's this valley that he would have to go up from the Sea of Galilee, from the Jordan Valley. And as he would head up the hill, there would be this little town of Nain, or Nain as they would call it. Verse 12, "And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out." Now you notice this, Luke is a Gentile writing, but he does it in the same way as the Hebrew writers would do. You kind of tell the story up to a point, and then you back up and you give more information. Because already, verse 11 said he went into the city. But now verse 12, we've backed up. He's coming near the gate. He's not there yet. If you look at the archaeology of the place, about a half mile out of town, on the hillside, there's a cemetery. And so Jesus was still about a half mile out, apparently, because he's heading in with his crowd, and the funeral procession is heading out with however many people were supporting that poor widow. It said a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Now, in our culture, it's bad enough to be widowed. In their culture, to be widowed was much deeper because they didn't have a place for women independently working for the most part. You find some who have their industry, usually with a husband. They would lean toward their children. Now, if you'll pardon me, I will sometimes use examples that come from the closest thing I know, which is when I lived in Korea. Korea has shifted so much over these last few decades, but when I was first there in 1985, things were really different than the Western world, and I would have to learn how people think, how they act, and how they express themselves. So, for example, one of my first experiences with mourning, with family mourning in death, is when the local pastor took me out into the countryside. We came to the home of a Korean family where the son had just lost his father to death. When the father dies, in Korean culture, and you see some of this in biblical culture too, there would be like a sackcloth coat, sackcloth slacks, and a sackcloth hat, a tall kind of pointy hat. And for about a month after, the person would still be wearing a little piece of sackcloth pinned to his clothes. But anyway, right after, he's in the sackcloth, the body's in the house, and all the sons line up on the veranda. And as you approach the house, they fall down to the ground on their knees, and they're calling out, "Aigo," a kind of mourning call, and stay down until you as a visitor get down on your knees, and then they can get up and talk. Well, sorry about what's happened to your father, and you have a conversation. Well, this is way worse because she had been widowed, and now her son has died too, and it calls him the monogenes, is the way Luke writes. That's the exact same word used for Jesus, the only begotten. So this is the only begotten son. Now you see, this story has some things that remind you a little bit of 1 Kings 17 or 2 Kings chapter 4, where Elijah first and later Elisha would be faced with the death of a child. That's something that we saw in Korea when I later was working there as academic dean of SDA Language Institute chain, and we had a missionary family from South Africa, the McLeod family. And their little boy, Chrissy, had a brain tumor that had gone into remission. They thought he was healed, and when they came to Korea, the tumor began growing again and eventually killed him. And so here's the little 4-year-old child, and there's such mourning, such sadness. And I remembered the story, especially of Elijah, where he went up into the upper room kind of thing, or up into the loft, it calls it, where the body had been laid out. And here was Chrissy up in the upper room, laid out, and the tumor had pushed his eye forward in its socket and all that, and just this little dead form, thinking, wow, this is what the prophet faced. But God had revealed to the prophet that day was a day for raising the dead. And there are a few rare occasions when that's the case. Anyway, it says in verse 12, a large crowd from the city was with her. One crowd meets another crowd. One crowd is so energetic, excited, thankful, happy, all this stuff coming up the hill. And the other crowd coming down the hill is so solemn and somber. And in the cultures of that place, there's more expression. You'd actually hear the cries. They don't kind of quietly wipe a little tear. Oh, we're so sorry for what's happened. No, they express the sorrow in loud mourning. I'll never forget the little child that most of my life I've been either in pastoral ministry or in education. And so when I was in Korea in the field of education, I wasn't always preaching. It's like once in 6 weeks I preach, and the other Sabbaths I could hold a baby and walk with a little child while he's kind of fussing or whatever, keep him busy before we can settle him down and go back into a service. And I'd be outside the church with another daddy as he was holding his little girl, Ji-hye, and then one morning she somehow got strangled in the bedding. And at her funeral, I remember again the horrible cries of the people who were going through the very vocal mourning, crying out, Ji-hye, Ji-hye. I'll never forget that haunting sound of the mother crying out the name of her lost child. But notice what Jesus said in verse 13. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. Well, I do want to look at that first, where it said he had compassion on her. Esplanknizo is the Greek word. The splanchon is this part of your body, your intestines. And the Hebrews and Greeks, as they expressed emotion, they talk about the verb form of your guts. Because when you're sad, you feel something down there. When you're excited, we even say in English, I have butterflies in my stomach, right? And there's no butterfly down there, but you feel something going on in the middle section. And so when there's a deep emotion, very deep compassion, they use that word, esplanknizo. And so we see that sprinkled through the gospel accounts, where it's not just Jesus looks and thinks, oh, no. He actually felt what they were feeling. He had this way of putting himself in the other person's sandals, so to speak. And so it says he had compassion on her and said, do not weep. I want to be really careful with that, do not weep. Sometimes we read our Bibles a little too quickly, and we see stories like this, and it says, see, that's what Jesus said, don't weep, don't be sad. You're going to see a child again someday, or whatever. But I want to challenge you. This week I went back to confirm it, and I looked at every place in the Bible that talked about weeping, especially looking for do not weep statements. And every place that the word came, do not weep, it's because that person's about to be raised from the dead. Or whatever the other problem is that happened is about to be taken away. So when God says through a prophet, or when Jesus says, do not weep, it's because what comes next is better. Even in Revelation, remember John's crying and the angel says to him, do not weep, because the Lion of the tribe of Judah, he can open the seal. So every time it says, do not weep, it's because you're right on the brink of this thing being changed for the good. Otherwise, if you read the Bible for the places where the person's crying and nobody says stop, you find that the person is receiving sympathy and compassion. There are a few exceptions, and those are places that represent the curse. Like when Ezekiel is told, your wife will die and you can't cry. And that represents what's going to happen to the city. And it's also when Aaron's 2 sons died for doing wrong, and God said, you can't mourn for those boys because you need to show to the camp that this was so wrong. And so you do see that exception when God is saying this represents the curse of what went wrong, and you as a lead figure have to not cry to show really what's happening next. So those are the 2 times when we see don't cry, is when it's representing the results of sin as a curse, and all the others are just, it's about to change. God's about to make it better. I never will forget the situation with the South African missionary boy Chrissy when he had died, and we went to the cemetery, and the man at the cemetery had offered a place, look, we won't even charge you, you can bury your child here. And later I had a conversation with him. It was a struggle. He didn't speak any English, so we just did our thing in Korean. But he said, they need to stop crying. They need to get this behind them. It's a child. Forget this child. Move forward. That's not biblical. But that is a coping mechanism that they used at that place at that time. It's what they understood. It's something that served them, and it's the same kind of coping mechanism we used in our country. I've heard so many times in America, people saying, don't cry, it's done. You'll see him later, or not. Seventh-day Adventists who think that, as soon as you die, you're with the Lord. Oh, it's okay, don't cry, he's with Jesus now. God called him home. Even though that's not exactly the way Jesus or Paul would describe it. Well, this time when Jesus said, don't cry, it's because he's about to change everything. And then he came and touched the open coffin, or your translation may say the bier, which is like a stretcher where the body's laid out. And if you go back to Numbers 19, you discover that's a no-no. If you touch even the coffin, you're unclean for, like 7 days. So Jesus worked in reverse. If he touched a leper, instead of becoming unclean, the leper was cleansed. If he touched a dead person, instead of becoming defiled by death, the one who is dead would be energized by life. He touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. So you can see, and so the first is, we're looking at 3 words in particular. The first one was his compassion, this splunk. Jesus really felt with people. Secondly, we looked at this whole business about do not cry. And thirdly, it's coming. He touched and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. Every time you see Jesus involved in a healing, you've got this time that only Luke tells. You have one in John 11 that only John tells about Lazarus. And then you've got Jairus' daughter that Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell about. And in every case, you notice Jesus does something. He identifies that one. It's not like he says, arise. I think there's a need for Jesus to be specific, because the cemetery is right there.
Right.
Can you imagine if he just said, arise, and all the tombs open? So he had to be really specific. Young man, arise. And with the little girl, Talitha Kumi, it even tells the actual words in his language, which means little girl, arise. And then Lazarus, come forth. In each case, he puts the name or the title, the kind of label of that person to identify just this one, this time. I'll call the rest of you later. So he who is dead sat up and began to speak. It's interesting, when I used to teach Life and Teachings of Jesus at Weimar, one of my students in an essay commented on this, that it wasn't just that the person came to life, but the person began to speak. And that student pondered, why might that be the case? Well, we don't know, but he or she was kind of imagining, what might be the reason Luke would write, this person began to speak? Well, I can imagine the shock of it, for one. Even when, it says right here, Verse 16, then fear came upon all. I mean, if you were at a funeral and the person suddenly sat up from the casket, then all the lids open and everyone's paying their respects, and he or she sits up, someone might pass out cold just watching it, you know. Even just being in a hospital room, and sounds come from dead bodies sometimes and sights, and it just scares people. Like, who said that? My father tells a story, I think it happened in Ohio, of a man who was a literature evangelist selling books, and this is way back, way back, and he had no horse. Have you heard the story? And he's trying to you've heard it. He's trying to find out, what can I do to get around more effectively? And meanwhile, one night he's returning home very late and takes a shortcut by the cemetery, and he hears this noise and discovers a grave robber out there. And the robber has already propped up the body in his buggy, and he's covering up the grave. And so, being very innovative, I guess, or having some ingenuity, this colporteur took the outer wrap off the grave, the corpse, hit the corpse back behind some bushes, and wrapped himself in that stuff in the same place where the body had been. And when the grave robber was in the buggy, they're going down the road, and the robber's got his arm around him, holding him up. And it gets bumpier and bumpier and bumpier, and every bump, you know, the body's flopping around, and the guy's squeezing him tighter and tighter until it's hard to breathe. And finally he said, "It's a cold night tonight." And suddenly he was alone in the buggy. He took the buggy to the police, and they said, "Well, keep it 2 weeks, and if no one claims it, it's yours." And you can't claim it, because if you claim the buggy, you're proving you're a thief. Anyway, so the colporteur got his buggy. There's something terrifying about being with one who's dead and finding something that belongs only to life. But when he spoke, apparently that was a reassuring thing. This wasn't just a strange corpse with words. These were words from her son. Can you imagine? Think of people that are close to you who've died, and one thing you might long for would be the sound of that person's voice. When we lived in Korea, of course, the culture is different. The food is different. Many things are different. That's not the hard part. The hardest part about living in a different place is you can't be with your family when the big stuff happens. If it's really, really big, you might go ahead and fly home for someone who's at death's door or something like that. But you miss the family. That's the hardest part about being so far away. And imagine don't have to imagine, Tyler taking grandkids up north and all that, and all of a sudden the highway becomes very familiar as grandparents are coming to visit. When you're far away, you try what you can to be there. So he sat up and began to speak, and that's Jesus, presented him to his mother. Well, that's kind of interesting to me, even that little detail. Jesus, we'll find him later when he raises Jairus' daughter. They're so excited that they don't even think she hasn't eaten for a long time. Jesus is the one that says, "You got to feed the girl," you know. Jesus is thinking about what is it that this person needs also. And it's almost like you see them, they're frozen, like she's looking, "Really?" You know, and this is your son, it's okay, you can touch him, he's alive now. You can almost imagine all that stuff. It's summarized with that little statement, Jesus presented him to his mother. And fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us," maybe reflecting Deuteronomy 18, where Moses talks about the great prophet that would come years after him, and how God would work through that great one that they would know would be Jesus one day. And God has visited his people. Wow. And that, I want to underline that, even if that's written in Greek, it makes us think back to the other times when it talks about that Hebrew verb in the Old Testament, hakad, to visit. You see it positive and negative. When God visits iniquities of the fathers unto the children and children's children, and he visits, he's there seeing what's going on. But when he visits, he does something. He's not passive. And in this case, God visited his people and he changed death into life. And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. And in Sabbath school lesson, we looked at times when he said, "Shh, don't tell anyone." Well, this time the report went and he didn't even try to stop it. I want to back up and look at 3 bits, because I'm focusing, among other things, on the compassion and the don't cry. Sheryl Sandberg, telling about what happened in her husband's death, she learned from a man named Martin Seligman that there are 3 things you go through when you're grieving that can slow down your recovery. If you can somehow work against those 3 things, you heal better. One is personalization. They all start with P, personalization. Somehow it's my fault. You can almost imagine this poor mother as she's going down the hill. What have I done wrong? Maybe if I called the doctor sooner. Maybe if I hadn't let him be around those sick people. I don't know what it was that took him. Maybe he died in an injury. We don't know. But personalization does come to us where we somehow claim it's my fault. It can come with grief from some other kind of loss, from a divorce, from some kind of relocation. Oh, it's my fault that mom and dad can't get along. It's my fault that personalization makes it so much harder to heal. Pervasiveness. My whole life is ruined. Now for the widow, that was just natural to think. Her husband's gone, and now her only son is gone. It's like there's nothing left for her. But the more we generalize it, this pervasiveness, it's in everything. I can't be happy in this part of life because that would disrespect the one that I lost in death, that I lost to this other thing. That pervasiveness where I feel like my whole life is, everything about my life is impacted, slows down the healing. And the 3rd P is permanence. I will never feel better. Oh, wait a minute. Is that really true? Time doesn't necessarily automatically eliminate pain. Time does dull the pain, but with time, we can take some very active steps that do make a change. And confronting the personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence, personalization is my fault. We can come to realize that no matter whose fault it is, we can take that to the Lord. He will bear that burden. He did bear that burden. He bears it beside us. And this story gave the example of how Jesus confronted the pervasiveness with compassion. It's not all about you. I feel what you feel. I am here for you. And even when he didn't raise other people's dead family members, he still had compassion for what they were feeling. And the piece on the pervasiveness. My whole life, everything about my life is ruined. Jesus comes and he confronts that first with a hint. He just touched the coffin. It's like, you can keep going, but no, not with Jesus there. Wait. And they all waited for the moment. And it's like something's going to change. Well, as he's doing that, he's not going through Seligman's list, but Jesus is confronting the concept that everything is bad. He was there with his people through the power of the Holy Spirit when they could not find relief, like John the Baptist, who would not come out of prison. Peter did, but James did not. And the different ones who were in prison, they could realize that no, and Paul writes most eloquently about this, it doesn't matter if I'm rich or poor, if I have plenty, or, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, there in Philippians 4. The context there is confronting this idea of pervasiveness. It's saying, I can deal with this by God's power, even though it's ugly. And he writes that a few years before his execution. And then permanence. I will never feel better. Jesus definitely confronted that as he said, don't cry, or literally, stop crying. It's like, wait, if he's saying stop crying, he's about to act. When God or God's messenger says stop crying, it's not because crying's bad. It's because crying is about to become unnecessary. Interestingly, at the end of time, we find that God is wiping away tears. It's only in the last maybe 20 years that I started really noticing that this is after we've had the second death. In Revelation 20, you have the second death, and in Revelation 21, you've got Jesus, or God, wiping away all tears. Apparently, there's a place to cry as part of the healing journey, and God gives the compassion, he gives the power, he gives the opportunity to heal by addressing where we have suffered. So this I will never feel better, Jesus confronts with, yes, it's about to change. And when it isn't about to change right now, there's still the hope of it will change by his power. He'll guide me through it now. He'll make it a different story later. He's going to challenge that. So Jesus is he's very much about not just how do I take people from the effects of sin, from the slavery to sin, but how can I reach into the lives that are damaged by the consequences of sin and bring them hope and healing. And so there was that challenge that Phil read to us earlier today from the bulletin. What is it that we can do? Or let's see how it's written. What is one thing you can do or say this week to help reduce another person's pain? You might not know what it is yet. You might be thinking, I could try this or this. It may be that God will actually put someone in front of you that you were not expecting in a phone call, text message, or Facebook post, or what have you. It may be you bump into this person at the gas station or in Walmart or wherever it is you're buying your groceries, and all of a sudden here's this person who's got some kind of pain, and maybe there's some small thing you can do or say. You might stretch really far. There are times when you could even say, may I just pray with you for a moment? That may be outside your comfort zone, but believe me, people find that healing when you actually reach out of your comfort zone. Usually when I've asked that question, people have not refused. Occasionally they'll say, oh no, I'm not comfortable here. But usually they'll say, please do. And you'd be amazed how open people are for a short, simple prayer that connects them with the compassionate heart of Christ. Just like this providential meeting of the two crowds going down the hill and going up the hill. The rejoicing crowd became sorrowful. The sorrowful crowd became joyful. And they all left praising God because a great prophet had risen among them.